years to go before the next presidential elections, and yet a survey firm has already listed down potential frontrunners.
In a survey conducted by the social weather stations, Vice President Sara Duterte emerged as the top choice to succeed President Bongbong Marcos in 2028.
Moving on now to another story. House Speaker Martin Romualdez has refused to discuss his alleged rift with Vice President Sara Duterte.
These movements, the dynamic we're seeing is part of a bigger picture, no? A coalition likely to break apart, no? Inevitably. Sara Duterte is wise, and I know she is. She'll keep this coalition together because right now everything is going for her.
Hintayin natin yung susunod na kabanata. Mukhang malinaw na kwanto eh. Malinaw na Game of Thrones.
5 years to go before the next presidential elections, with President Marcos going on his second year in office, and already a survey on the frontrunners. What could have been the motivation of getting the pulse of the voting public this early? We talk about this and other issues on politics in this episode of The Chiefs. And welcome to The Chiefs. I'm Ed Lingao. With me in the studio, Robbie Alapay of One News and Ana Marie Pamintuan, the Editor-in-Chief of the Philippine Star. Chiefs, magandang gabi.
Magandang gabi.
Okay, politika na naman tayo. Going to the first year. Going to the second year.
Parang sobrang aga.
Di ba nahuli?
Sabagay, if we're going to talk about 2025 siguro, pwede na, no?
Pero
Kaya
hindi, talaga
Presidente,
2028 ang pinunteriya eh.
Sobra yun, Hindi, pag-usapan, siguro, sino ba yung nag-commission yan ang tanong?
Oo.
Diba? It's a commission survey,
si
remember?
Congressman Arnel T. Yeah.
And sinong ka-alyado niya? Siyempre, tinatanong yan ng mga tao,
Yeah,
no?
of course.
Kasi medyo nawala yung isang pangalan dun sa list ng mga presidentiables, hindi ba?
Dati
So,
siyang sa
tinatanong.
LPGMA party list.
Which is affiliated with...
Tantantini.
Tanong ka ng tanong, sabihin mo na yung mga sagot.
Hindi ba?
Doon pa lang sa pangalan ng party list eh.
Hindi kasi lumabas siya, no? I mean, we're talking about the background, yung mga developments in recent weeks. Di ba, nag-away-away. Ito yung isang grupo, puro kaalyado ni President Marcos. But here is VP Sara with former President
Jimmy
Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo.
And?
And on the other hand, yung kamag-anak talaga nung nakaupo sa Malacanang, si Speaker Martin Romualdez.
Okay. So,
Whose name is not in the list
so
ng
ano gusto mong
president.
palabasin?
Hindi, yun lang naman na sinasabi ng mga tao. Alam mo naman dito basta may lumabas na survey, yan ang mga tanong,
pero
di
di
ba?
ba delikado rin yun, di ba? Kasi sabi nga nila, lumabas ka masyadong maaga,
you
itaas
start
mo yung ulo mo, baka...
You're an early
Baka
target.
mabinay ka. Yan ang sinasabi. Di ba, no, I'm sorry, pero talaga siya ginagamit na example. Di ba? You pick too early, you become popular early. In fact, it happened also to Manny Villar. Di ba? Siya yung frontrunner
Then they have more time to dig up more stuff on you.
Yan na nga. Yan ang sasabi nila na kung si President Duterte daw medyo ganun kaaga kasing aga ng mga
And then you
4 years.
You stay longer on the target board.
Yan.
Pero on the other hand, kaya naman pinag-uusapan yan dahil enjoy din yung mga Pilipino dahil maraming pangalan lumalabas. Hindi lang sa potential or possible presidential runners, pati sa Senado, tinitingnan mo sino bang matunog ngayon.
Pero mukhang
Tapos
puro
iakit mo rin yun, di ba? Pagka number 1 ka sa di tataas mo rin yun sa mga usapan
May problema din yun sa survey, no? Di ba? Siyempre, ang lalabas at lalabas dyan yung mga sikat
Oo. Kaya nga dalawa yung di ba? Mayroong isang open-ended yata or basta. But anyway, ang punto lang dito is we can have many contexts here, not just the 2028 elections, not just 2025. We also have, it's still the first year of President Marcos. We're going to mark the first year of his presidency. So, pati dyan, maganda yung sukatan. Makita mo rin kung sino yung umaangat na mga pangalan.
Okay, we bring in our guests right after this short break. The Chiefs will be right back.
Welcome back to the program. Joining us this evening, political analyst Richard Haydarian and Arj Aguirre. Good evening. Welcome to the Chiefs.
Good evening po.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Sa ba nakatingin?
Good evening.
Sa ba nakatingin? Okay, umpisa natin kay I'm Professor Aguirre. I hope you don't mind. Umpisa natin dito kay Richard Haydarian kasi may door prize kay dahil nandito kay.
Yeah, that's
Diba?
sorry. I
Kailangan
was
priority. So, sa lahat ng guest sa Chiefs, priority yung nandito sa studio. Okay, umpisahan po natin. Yung unang tanong natin kay Mr. Haydarian. Ang aga-aga pa, ba't ka nagko-commission ng presidential survey?
well, sa game theory may tinatawag na shadow of the future, no?
Okay.
Kasi kung yung expectations mo about the future shape yung calculations mo, alignments mo ngayon. So, kung isang tao ay considered as shoe-in to be the next president, yung kanyang power today at yung alignments ng mga ibang tao ay apektado dyan. But if you think that the field is open, may mga ibang karibal, then that actually mixes things up. So, very important ano mangyayari sa 2028 because for the first time, meron tayong isang situation na may tandem na very dominant yung performance. I think this was the only majoritarian tandem we have had in at this recent Philippine history, since mid-20th century. So after nung elections, especially because Sara, mas malaki pa yung share niya kay di ba, Marcos?
Yes.
So lampas sa 60%.
Yes.
So she was considered as the shoe-in and that created its own political capital for her. But now, mukhang base dun sa mga ibang surveys, the field could be much more fluid and competitive. And mahalaga din because meron din ng expectations na baka itong unity may hindi mag-last for long.
Okay.
If not, as early as now, we already see na may mga fault lines within the ruling coalition.
Sige. So nakikita niyo naman pa bakit gusto namin si Mr. Haydarian. Dahil kahit anong tanong mo, papatulan niya. So just for the record, for everyone joining us, that's not a serious context. Hindi siya ang nag-survey ng SWS survey. Notwithstanding that, I mean, yung pinag-uusapan namin, is that good or bad? Isn't there such a thing as, number one ka nga, but it's way too early to be sticking your head up? Diba? Parang hindi ba, couldn't that cut both ways?
Well, the sticking your head up, it applies to any vice president, right? Because ang expectation is yung vice president one breath away from the presidency or at least he'll run for the presidency next. So immediately nandyan ka na sa usapan, diba, as far as 2028 is concerned. But for me, what's also fascinating is dito sa mga numbers for 2028, makikita natin kung gaano ka solid yung unit team. Remember, lampas sa 60% na nakuha nila based on the official numbers we have from 2022. Pero kung titignan mo sino yung mga leading ngayon, we're looking at numbers which are much more historically familiar, 20+%. 10% plus, right? So mukhang yung solidness ng unit team did not last beyond the elections and we're going back to what was status quo ante before the unit team was formed. Remember, Sara Duterte was also around the same numbers, 25 to 30% nung considered siya for presidential candidacy. So in short, maybe that shows that the unit team, 60%, that's much more ephemeral, much more fluid, much more contingent than many people assume. It's not a solid block that can last for long, especially up until 2028. So that 28%, 30% we see for Sara, it's very telling. Because if really solid yung unit team, dapat the numbers are 60, 70%, tapos na usapan.
Pero taso ng konti muna. Kasi VP nga, di ba? Of course, you're breath away from the presidency. Pero at the same time, you're looking at the example of Jojo Binay. VP dati, masyadong magang umangat ang ulo, pak. Lantay siya.
Right. The situation was even worse for Lenny Robredo, right? Pinaalis pa siya sa kabinete, etc. So, usually, it's a very tricky situation. Ilan bang naging vice president, naging president? Like Erap, Arroyo, you had a back-to-back situation and then it didn't last long after that. So for me, always the question was, will this VP be a different situation? Will it be as given as what we had during Arroyo or Erap, or will it be as weekend VP or spare tire, as some would put it, during the Lenny and... But people were saying maybe Sara Duterte will be a completely different thing because she was very instrumental to the victory of the unit team in 2022. But now we're seeing things could turn out very different, unprecedented situation we can see here. Yeah.
President Marcos has described her as his BFF, di ba?
Yeah, number one
Sabi
fan.
na,
I'm still your number one
yes,
fan.
and Sara Duterte has professed her love for the
Right.
president. So, pero hanggang ngayon, meron pa rin mga spekulasyon about the unit team being disunited. Professor, what are your thoughts on the survey? Yung iba, sinasabi, ang aga-aga naman yan. Ngayon lang nagkaroon ng ganyang kaagang survey on the presidency. What are your thoughts?
Unang-una, ang unang masasabi natin dito ay, yun nga, maraming mga political stakeholders ang gusto sigurong makita ko na yung mangyayari sa 2028, no? Tama si Prof. Richard kanina na maraming pwedeng mangyari sa sabihin nating panahon na kung saan nag-aantay ang mga political stakeholders. Merong mga alliances na bubuo, coalition na mababaklas, at nalalapit na nga yung midterm elections. May kita natin na yung alignments pwedeng maging solid pa yung mga samahan or yung mga existing na mga coalitions. So dito sa nakaraang survey, ang una ko na obserbahan, tama yung nabanggit kanina, yung leading na candidate ay hitik na pwedeng tirahin siya sa mga panahon na ito upang siguro mapahina yung kanyang hold, yung kanyang support. Nangyari yan nung panahon na namumuno or yung nga nangingibabaw yung support na meron kay VP Binay. So kung matatandaan ninyo, bago mag-midterm election, di ba, in-announce na rin niya na siya ay nag-iisip na tumakbo bilang presidente. So sunod-sunod yung pag-atake sa kanya ng mga panahon na ito. So siguro yung motivation dito sa nakaraang survey ay ganun din, no? So i-reveal na ang sabi nating maraming suporta o nangingibabaw sa kamalayan ng mga tao ay si Sara Duterte. So ito yung nagbibigay din ng mensahe sa ibang political stakeholders na pwede na itong tirahin or i-criticize sa mga darating na taon. So crucial dito yung midterm election. So dapat tingnan natin na ano ba yung konteksto dito. So pinalabas yung survey, pinakita kung sino leading. So pinapakita rin dito na sa midterm elections magkakaroon o mabubuo yung iba't iba nating mga alignments or coalition. So inobserbahan ko dito yung kasalukuyang coalition na nagpapatakbo ng ating gobyerno. Tama yung nasabi rin kanina na marami na rin cracks. May mga tension. Siguro i-exploit nila ito para makaporma sila sa darating na presidential elections sa 2028.
Ay, pero Prof, ano ko lang yun, cracks pa lang ba? Kasi parang si Professor Heydaria parang binuwag na ano bang basa nyo dyan sa coalition na yan? Let's be explicit about it. The Marcos Duterte coalition. Ano bang basa nyo dyan?
Ang nakikita ko dito obviously merong grupo na nangingibabaw or merong effective control na tinatawag. They want it to be intact. Yun yung point doon. Kasi sila'y nakikinabang dito sa coalition na ito. At masasabi ko dito, ito yung grupo nila Sara Duterte Carpio. Nasa likod nito ang kanyang mentor na si former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. Kung makita ninyo, 60 to 70% of the important cabinet positions connected sa kanila, mga dating opisyal o dating na-appoint din ng dating Pangulong Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, mga dati ring mga sabi nating kilalang dikit sa grupo ni Sara Duterte Carpio. Kung titingnan ninyo, yung mismong mga tao na gustong-gustong sabihin nating pahinain or pabagsakin o tanggalin siguro yung impluensya ni Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, sila yung naapektuhan dito sa dominance na ito. So, kung makita ninyo, pumutok na to yung sa nakaraang issue with the Speaker of the House. So, nakita ko dito, the Speaker of the House, si Speaker Martin Romualdez, he wanted to have this control over the Lakas Party. Kasi sobra na yung control na meron ang grupo nila Sara Duterte Carpio. So, ang nakita ko dito, puputok ito sa midterm election. So, magkakaroon ito ng kanya-kanyang mga lineup. Pero, ang kanilang press release, syempre, intact pa rin ang coalition. So, makita niya yan doon sa mga statements na ginawa ng ating Pangulo, ginawa ng ating ikalawang Pangulo, na sinasabi nila, pa rin, ang coalition ay very strong pa rin, tapos meron pa rin cooperation. Pero sa baba, makita ninyo, meron ng tension, meron ng parang nangyayaring hiwalayan. So, again, magiging obvious siya sa midterm elections. Asahan natin na meron itong mga kanya-kanyang mga lineup. Tapos, syempre, magiging dito, yung sa presidential election. So, sa 2028, obviously, doon magkakaalaman kung sino ba talaga yung maglalaban-laban.
So Professor, you don't see a breakup before the midterm elections? I asked that kasi, in the end, a lot of people are saying na baka maging new opposition, hindi na yung mga dilawan at mga
Right.
mga pink
Right.
pinklawan. Pero itong grupo ng mga Dutertes,
Well,
NGMA.
well, the thing is with President Marcos Jr., he's a very non-confrontational personality. He's the antithesis of Duterte, who was the previous president was inviting polarization almost, right? So I'm not surprised with everything he said. Now he downplayed the divisions within the House, he downplayed supposed cracks. But the reality is that regardless of what the president says, we see a lot of differences on core issues.
Yeah.
Katulad ng mga isang sinulat ko recent for Nikkei Asia, the issue of China and issue of relations with the US is already becoming a really big divisive factor dun sa
Friction
ruling
point.
coalition. Exactly. I mean, we know that a huge part potentially of the whole Deputy Speaker of the House drama was there are people who want to become the Speaker of the House to challenge Marcos' foreign policy. No, I mean there are even crazier conspiracies I've heard. And we know that the Dutertes, whether the daughter or the father, they may not agree on everything, but I think both of them are on the same idea that we have to maintain robust and friendly relations with China. I'm not even talking about other core issues like President Marcos Jr. is not as gung-ho on the drug war or even on the issue of crackdown on communist movement. So there are already many ideological differences between the House of Marcos and House of Duterte, which we were already discussing 2-3 years ago. But now it's becoming more important because while Marcos Jr. is not confrontational towards Duterte, he's also friendly towards the liberals,
Yeah.
right? The name of Maro Rojas keeps on popping up. We don't know DTI. I even heard Department of Foreign Affairs potentially for him. Why? Because we know that's the thing, it cuts both ways. If you're friendly and non-confrontational, that means you don't want to pick fight with your old friends, but you're also open to new friends who could be your old enemies, right? So there's that flexibility. And I think the thing with Marcos Jr. is that because of the reshuffling in the cabinet, there's a lot of space for building a grand coalition whereby no one is dominant, neither the Arroyo faction, nor the Duterte faction, nor the Romualdez faction. So he can mix it up. So in a way, the unity formula of Marcos Jr. gives him a lot of room for maneuver if he knows how to use it for the coming years or so.
But is Sara a BFF or a BFFN? Best friend for now?
Well, I think on the personal level, they're going to be friendly for the foreseeable future. But the thing is, you're talking about ruling coalition. You're talking about alignments. You're looking at actual policies. So whether I call you BFF or not, on policy questions, I'm not sure they're BFF. His pivot to the U.S. is not a BFF to any of the Dutertes, right?
By the way, dun sa, at least on the foreign policy, do you think that forces and interests outside of the country will keep that divide?
I think there are foreign powers who have a very clear interest of making sure that the ruling coalition is not solidly behind Marcos Jr.'s friendly relations with the U.S. The whole EDCA question, etc. So the reality is that the China question is dividing the Philippines anew,
So in
and
other
the division
words,
is within the.
it's not. In other words, it's not just domestic politics.
It's not,
that will compel them to either make this a differentiator between us, or maybe we can come together.
Robbie, the
reality is-
Philippines is at the front line of the proxy war between U.S. and China. Let's just be brutally honest about it. We are in a serious situation here. I mean, as someone who does foreign policy, I'm just saying we need to appreciate more the nexus between domestic political alignments and the foreign policy situation. So this, I think, will be a very tricky balance,
But
balancing act for Marcos
Professor
Jr.
Aguirre, does that mean that all the way to 2025 and all the way to 2028, foreign policy will actually be at the center of the campaigns? That this is actually something that might drive, differentiators, and for that matter, drive, platforms of government that will actually be an issue for voters.
I think so, given that for the past, 6 years of the Duterte administration, many people really felt that, our country became so close again with China. So again, that's number one. The Chinese question that was already mentioned by Professor Richard, it will become an issue for the midterm election and of course for the next presidential election. May ongoing tension sa international community ngayon involving Russia, tapos yung alignment din ng China sa issue na ito. Makikita ninyo na ang magiging sabi nating contentious issue sa kamalayan ng ating mga kababayan sa midterm election ay yun nga, will the Philippines stay as as sabi nating an ally of China, and of course sabi nating sympathizer dun sa nangyaring gulo sa Russia at sa Ukraine, or yun nga, magkakaroon tayo ng shift sa sabi natin pagbalik natin dun sa magandang relationship natin with the US. So I'm sure the political operators will use this for the midterm election as one of the issues na pwedeng ibato sa magiging sabi nating ticket ng administrasyon. Tapos yung mga magiging challenger, in-expect ko yung opposition na mag-emerge na ticket nila, I'm sure i-raise din nila yung issue nga ng foreign policy shift.
You think top of mind sa Pilipino?
I know that's what you were going to say.
DFA?
Of course, I doubt that foreign policy is going to be
Yes,
taught. I think Arjan is being just nice. He didn't want to contradict.
But
that's my point.
You remember si Duterte, his
Right.
pivot to China. He retained his high popularity ratings throughout, kahit
Ang taas ng distrust,
distrust ng China is they were the most distrusted sa mga
the point,
malalaking
the
bansa.
point is a bit more nuanced, right? So we saw the SWS and Pulse Asia survey very clear. 8 or 9 out of 10 Filipinos wanted us to take a tougher stance on the West Philippines issue. We saw President Duterte, no matter how popular he was, he had to eventually retract some of his anti-American positioning. So while he was generically popular, he had to still respect the popular opinion on specific issues like the West Philippines Sea issue. Now, yes, it doesn't make sense for any democracy to make a foreign policy issue center unless there's a war and peace situation. But the thing is, that's one of the few areas where the differentiation is very clear. Because while Marcos Jr. on the drug war issue, on the the red tagging issue, he's very nice, right? He never says I disagree with the former president. So he always tries to say there's a continuity, but there's an improvement. But really on the foreign policy issue, I think that's where the differentiation is much more clear. So if you're trying, not Marcos Jr., but if some of his empresarios want to position his faction against the Duterte faction, the China issue is going to be one of the issues they're going to raise.
Di ba nagkakasaran lang yan? Kasi there was an indication from the statement of VP Sara, no, na yun na nga, ang nag-persuade daw sa kanya to slide down to the VP, si Aimee and not Speaker Romualdez. And meron daw siyang condition na sinet to slide down. And we're thinking, baka hindi ba yung one of the conditions is that GMA has to be the speaker, at kaya nagkaroon ng ganitong problema ngayon si Speaker Martin, kasi talagang siya yung gusto ng pinsan niya.
Well, she didn't get also the defense secretary
She
position.
did get it,
So I'm sure it's not one or two
Yeah.
conditions
Yan na
alone.
nga,
Yeah,
yan na nga.
yeah.
Diba?
And we know that Arroyo. I mean, President Arroyo has probably been the most influential Filipino political figure in terms of shaping our foreign policy. I mean, I interviewed her back in 2019. She said on the record, yes, President Duterte, his views is aligning with mine. She was supposed to be a secret weapon of President Marcos, etc. So the Arroyo factor is not just about domestic political coalition building. It's also about the China factor. It's also about foreign policy because President Arroyo has more experience in dealing with China than anyone else, right? Throughout 10 years of presidency, throughout shaping the foreign policy of Duterte, among others. So, yeah, I'm sure that Sara will. But I think the context of playing down the role of Romualdez was more the direct,
Yes.
not really about the specifics of what was really the conditions for. I mean, the reality is that President Marcos Jr. after winning within a week or so made it very clear. Now I'm the president.
Yes.
Now I have the prerogative, and Sara Duterte had to respect that. Now, the question is, how long can this situation last if Marcos Jr. is not going to give some of the key things that they were asking for back in the day?
Let me shift a bit. Yung Professor Aguirre, kanina nga pinag-uusapan natin, and even in the past episodes, President Marcos hanging on, I don't know how you characterize it now, hanging on or left with the agriculture portfolio. The messaging started with, napakahalaga niyan, kaya dapat ako mag-ano niyan. Around December, they started admitting na, well, the president is already looking for somebody. Pagkatapos last week, walang gustong mag-volunteer, walang gustong tumanggap Parang, and it's almost, tongue-in-cheek na, I guess, gusto nila akong manatili dito. How big of an albatross is this going to be around the president's neck? And either way, isn't it a weakness for him? Whether he surrenders and admits, hindi ko kaya to, or panindigan niya to, and alam naman natin, parang it's not the easiest job. It's probably still the hardest job in the country right now. How big how big an issue is this going to be for the president, and is he going to regret holding on to food prices, holding on to food inflation, holding on to agriculture?
Well, even before he decided yun nga, to run, I was already expecting na yun nga, he will really have a control or yun nga, a role to play dun sa agriculture yun nga, industry natin. So when he decided eventually to become the agriculture secretary, parang given na na yun nga, he wanted to have this control over this department kasi most of the sabi nating industries attached to the agriculture sector parang connected do sa kanyang support base. That's number one. Many of his voters, tapos many of his supporters din na nag-fund ng kanyang kampanya, makikita mo identified with the different industries na attached dito sa sector na ito. Tapos number two, may kita natin na most of the issues prices, commodities, attached siya dun sa sa kamalayan ng ordinaryong tao. So again, support based, tapos yung kamalayan ng ordinaryong tao, may kita ninyo na agriculture sector is really one of the sabi nating areas na kadalasan parang hinahabol-habol ng mga political actors kung ikaw ay mamumuno. So expected siya sa ating Pangulo na ito yung kanyang parang tututukan o hawakan. Pero sa mga nangyayari ngayon, hindi natin control yung sabi natin prices ng mga commodities, tapos hindi pa rin talaga napapababa yung mga important na mga produkto na hindi nagiging accessible sa mga ordinaryong tao. Nagiging magiging Achilles heel ito in the coming years kung hindi niya ito maasikaso talaga o hindi niya ito mahawakan ng maayos. Kaya ina-expect ko rin na hindi ito matatapos. In the coming years, marami pa ring issue na lalabas. Magkakaroon pa rin ng pagtaas ng mga presyo, magkakaroon pa rin ng mga sabi nating shortages ng mga important na products. So yung naranasan natin last time na na nagkaroon ng shortage sa onion, tapos tumaas yung presyo ng sugar. Magtutuloy-tuloy yan. I-expect ko in the coming years.
Pero Prof, yung management or mismanagement or even lack of management sa issue ng agriculture, dumidikit ba siya doon sa Pangulo, concurrent Agriculture Secretary? Kasi, well, his ratings are still high, even though doon sa surveys, there's dissatisfaction on the way that inflation is being handled. I asked that kasi, well, in the end, and we know this, maraming politiko may pagka-teflon. Hindi dumidikit kahit anong hawak nila.
Surprisingly, the president was so effective in distancing himself dun sa mga nagpuputukang mga issue. Like for example, kung makita ninyo, maraming mga sacrificial lambs na ang lumabas marami na silang pinaresign, marami na silang naakusahan na sabihin natin non-performing. Non-performing ng mga officials. Pero yun nga very effective ito sa pag-connect sa mga tao na yun nga, I'm a working president, I'm taking care of controlling the prices, and at the same time, yun nga, meron akong mga na-identify na mga problema dito na hindi ako may cause. Ang may kagagawan nito yung mga non-performing na nasa loob din ng kagawaran. So napakaganda ng kanyang kanyang pag-handle so far na may problema sa agriculture para industry, pero yun nga, pinapakita niya na meron siya ginagawa, meron siyang ginagawang sabi nating solusyon, tapos yun nga, meron na sa sacrifice na surprisingly, magagaling din yung ibang mga nawala o nasipa nila sa kagawaran
Pero, Prof, effective ba ang strategy at communications niya para hindi dumikit sa kanya yung mga batikos na yun? O, sa totoo lang ba, wala pang bumabanat ng maayos when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to food, when it comes to the prices of commodities? That's something that we will continue to ask. We just need to take a short break. Keep it here on One News.
Welcome back. Still with us, political commentators Richard Heydarian and Arjan Aguirre. Balikan, well, we took off from, mukhang sinabi ni President Marcos we will have to put up with him for some time, no? Sabi niya, he wants systems in place first. Yung systems na yun, medyo komplikado, parang 20 pesos per kilo rice yun
Well, I mean,
diba?
right.
No, he wants food security, he wants stable prices, he wants decent earnings for the farmers. Matinding aspirations yun before he leaves the post. That's what he said.
Right.
So we might have him as Agriculture Secretary all the way to 2028. What do you think will be the impact of that?
My thing is, if you look at both Duterte and Marcos, their number one strategy is to present themselves as what you can call developmental leaders, right? Na ang daming kapalpakan ng mga dating administration, you need me to really work this through. And because I'm working from not even 0, -10, kung may mga kapalpakan mangyari, hindi ko kasalanan yan. Kasalanan ng mga dating administration. That's why we see, on many issues, President Duterte objectively did not attain his goals. But always the excuse would be, no, because at least he started dealing with this issue. Because ang dami niyang mga na-inherit na kapalpakan sa dating administration. So Marcos can always do that. I think where Marcos could be vulnerable is if other powerful poles weaponize these issues against him. It could come from rival factions. It could come from popular senators there. But so far, I don't see that. That's why I think President Marcos Jr. can continue to make this rhetoric, this developmental rhetoric.
You don't see that, or
Because the opposition is not there.
Exactly. Ayun nga yung point ko. You don't see that, or you don't see an opposition.
I just don't think the opposition line is resonating as much because where does the opposition come from? It's attached to the administrations that are being blamed as the root of the problem. So whenever the opposition comes, it's, oh, anong ginawa ni Aquino? Anong ginawa ni Ramos, right? And whether you agree or not with the factuality of that argument, that argument sells. So that kind of demobilizes
But
the
what's
opposition.
the opposition? Parang, you said the opposition. What's the opposition line? Who's the opposition? But
Who's the
clearly,
opposition?
clearly, in the meantime, habang walang sagot dyan, clearly there are so many issues and vulnerabilities. I'm not even saying that these are things that are wrong. For example, on the military side, MUP. Diba? That's a very sensitive thing where the president has put his foot down. He's taking a very big political risk here with a very important, very powerful
Constituency.
sector.
Yeah.
Agriculture is very clearly a performance-based issue for which he is failing, objectively speaking. Diba? So, there are these things. Then Maharlika Investment Fund. There are these things, but nobody seems to be picking up the
My
issues.
point is that unless we have a weird situation whereby, I don't know, the liberal opposition, Duterte's, I don't know, even Tulfos, maybe all of them criticize, I think that's where it can make an impact. But I just doubt that's going to happen. And Marcos has a lot of levers. I mean, on the ICC issue, for instance, he has a lot of levers on that issue. So,
But you're
I'm
treating
not...
the Dutertes as the opposition here.
I mean, if you have
Diba?
a
Yun nga yung
weird
point,
counter
you're-
alliance, that could be an issue. I'm just not seeing that happening anytime soon. I think the points of difference is just so much that those counter alignments or counter coalition, I just don't see that happening. And my point is, Marcos also has his own levers. So if there are people who are hoping that failures or lack of progress on the Department of Agriculture will bring him down anytime soon, I'm just slightly skeptical about that. Because yun nga to bring him down, you have to be effectively weaponize those issues. But who's going to do that? Is there going to be an effective counter-coalition to do that? I'm still not seeing that happening. But that's the scenario I can look at where Marcos can get really hurt. Because Duterte never got hurt despite failures after failures on a lot of key issues. Because he'll always blame the previous administration. He'll say, at least ako, may nagawa ako. And that's exactly what Marcos is saying. No one took care of the agriculture issue since my father. And he's kind of right. I mean, I cannot blame him. Much of the irrigation infrastructure we have is from Marcos' era. We just maintain that. So that's why that argument can go on for quite some time. So I think you should not underestimate Marcos Jr.'s ability to have the Teflon effect, precisely because he's presenting himself as a developmental leader who's fixing all the failures of previous administration, except his father, of course.
Professor Arjun, kayo po, let me swing back to that question. Who is coalescing as the real opposition from 2025? Are we still looking at a Dilawan Pinklawan opposition? Or are we now looking at...
Mas alam ni Arjan yan, hindi ako magsalita.
Are we looking at a GMA Duterte opposition?
Well, number one, we can expect that the existing opposition coalition will still parang try their best to, sabi nating, challenge, okay, the ruling coalition. So come midterm election, I'm expecting that they will come up with their own list of candidates. But yes, there is also a possibility that there will be a new opposition, given na baka mamaya mag-worsen itong tension na ito within the ruling coalition. So we can also expect that a new force will emerge in the midterm election. Again, depende ito kung yun nga mag-worsen pa yung tension nila. So yung bagong magiging opposition na ito, yun nga, tama kayo, sila pwedeng sila Sara Duterte Carpio at yun nga sila former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. So may mga alignments pa na parang pwede nating expect. For example, saan susuporta sila Villar Faction. Saan sila susuporta given na sa ngayon secondary player sila. But no, in the coming years, may kita ninyo na mag-emerge sila as a main player. Baka nga sila pwedeng maging kingmaker na rin. Kasi pwede silang pumesto bilang vice president sa next presidential election. Tapos marami na rin silang presence sa iba't ibang yung partido nila Nationalista Party. I'm sure magkakaroon ng build-up.
Actually,
Matatapos
Prof,
na kasi yung
actually, Prof, mas nagwa-wonder ako kung saan lilinya yung liberal coalition eh. Are they going to be part of the administration or part of the or another kind of opposition?
Perhaps kung magkakaroon nga ng sabihin nating realignment of forces, pwede nating maisip na baka mag-align sila do sa bagong opposition na mag-emerge. So I cannot imagine that these liberal forces na nag-exist na ngayon na sila yung opposition na makikipag coalesce sila with the ruling coalition ng yung Marcos bloc na tinatawag. So mas feeling ko magko-coalesce sila do sa mag-emerge na bago So sila Sara Duterte. Yun yung ina-expect ko na pwedeng mangyari.
Arjan, what if Leila de Lima is released? Because I think that could be a big thing, right? I think if former Senator Leila de Lima is released within the next 6 months or so, which is quite reasonable given the court timing we're I think that could split the opposition. I think there'll be a lot in this. We already have whatever is left of Liberal Party. Some of them are already quite on Maharlika Fund issue because they love the USP vote.
Well, first
right?
of all,
so I think that could create its own dynamics
First of all, would you agree that De Lima finally getting released is the final shoe to drop on the ruling coalition?
I don't think so. There's still the ICC issue. I think that's going to be big. But I think that could open up a floodgate of splintering within the Liberal Party, the coalition bringing some people from the Liberal Party, or a lot of opposition saying, well, I'm not a fan of Marcos, but I rather, not side with the other one.
Between one or the other.
Exactly. So I think that's very important. But one factor we're not talking about, if you look at the surveys, who's next to Sara Duterte? Tulfo.
Tulfo.
You look at the unaided numbers for Senate preference, it's another Tulfo actually tops it. Diba? There's an aided, there's an unaided. So Erwin Tulfo potentially topping the Senate in 25. You have Rafi Tulfo, already a top contender, seeing as an alternative. For me, it also matters. I like that Arjan Aguirre talked about the Villars, who are going to be also very powerful for the foreseeable future. But I think the Tulfos are potentially even more than a kingmaker in the coming years. So I think the tensions within the ruling coalition, the alignments and realignments could only actually provide a space for the rise of new forces.
And I think I was going to ask you about that.
And Tulfos, I think, could be a big factor.
A non-aligned. Kasi why do the pink ones have to align with any of the Marcos or the Duterte factions? Hindi ba? They can, they got 15 million votes.
Right.
And another more than 5 million, 6 million people did vote for this unit team, no? That's a considerable number.
It's a considerable number if it's sustained, right?
Yes.
But Lenny is still sending us very mixed signals. I understand that she wants to rest and all, but she's saying I will still remain a public servant even if I don't go for elected office. We can see from the survey numbers, Lenny has a good chance to win in the Senate. She's within striking distance, and also she's number 3 for potentially for 2028. But we still don't know who's the real opposition leader. Is it Riza? Is it is it Lenny? So there's still a lot of confusion there. I think that just helps the Tulfos. Tulfos, who
Okay.
are emerging as one of the poles. And if you look at the Tulfos, it's not non-alignment, it's multi-alignment. There are issues whereby they're closer to the opposition. For instance, the NGCP issue, right? The National Grid. The Tulfo line is very similar to the Rizzo Ontiveros line. There are other issues whereby he's on close terms with the president. There are issues whereby he hedges. So,
Yun ang
multi-alignment.
And speaking
Yeah.
of the
Non-aligned.
Tulfos,
Yeah.
speaking of the Tulfos, I mean, we were taking note of that even before the elections.
Of course,
there
yeah.
there were even issues where, correct me if I'm wrong, Rafi, Senator Tulfo in
Right.
particular, was starting to soften the edges around even things like capital punishment,
Right.
and so on. So, but frame him for us as somebody around which a third force
Right.
might coalesce.
Yeah, if you look at it, so the Tulfos are not necessarily with either side here. They're emerging as their own force to reckon with, and they don't have a clear ideological line on issues because they're really, well, from their perspective, they're pushing for what's best for the country, given the circumstances. For me, this is the Tulfo moment, but the antecedents of that were already there, right? The whole macho, decisive leader, public servant, spontaneous, relatable. Isn't that actually what helped Duterte to become the president? In fact, well before Duterte became a national figure and the president,
Non-traditional.
the Tulfos were already there. So I think if Tulfos become, forget about kingmakers, something more than kingmakers, you could actually argue historically it's a belated phenomenon. You would have expected this happening. But I think after the whole Duterte phenomenon, the Tulfos felt confident that their time may have arrived. And just look at how Rafi Tulfo has navigated the Senate. He's almost like a senior senator the way he acts. And he's not coming off as someone who's overzealous and trying to be too bibo. No, he comes up with authority. And you can see on the Maharlika issue, he was the one who put people together, pushed for the final compromises, etc. And he has the ears of the president too, even well he's not fully endorsing a lot of key policies of the administration. So I think the Tulfo moment has been in the making for quite some time. But now, as we see the opposition still in a hibernation mode, we still see the Duterte-Marcos dynamics not steady. The unity, by some estimates, is not there anymore in terms of the constituency. I think this is the perfect time for the Tulfos to come out. So one of the realignments they're looking at is, will Marcos back Tulfo down the road? Will the opposition back the Tulfos down the road if they indeed become the rallying point as an alternative to Sara Duterte? Because the fact of the matter is that Sara Duterte is still seen as the front runner to succeed Marcos Jr. by all accounts. Yeah.
Professor Aguirre, I mean, the reality also is that after the senatorial elections, anybody who's number one, number two is immediately pushed into the conversations for the next elections. Anong nakikita mo sa mga Tulfo?
Well, number one, we have to, parang highlight that, they are becoming a major dynasty na rin, given that, recently, pumasok na yung kapatid na si Erwin sa House of Representatives. Number two, makita natin na, they're very popular. Tulfo has become a political brand na rin. Nakalimutan yung banggitin kanina, ang brand ng Tulfo ngayon, kilala sa kamalayan ng tao as sumbungan. So this is something that many people nowadays really like about the Tulfo branding, na madali nila sumbungan. Yung show nga ni Senator Rafi, nag-exist pa rin eh. Millions of viewers ang laging sumusubaybay dito. So makita natin itong sabihin nating strengths na ito na mag-unfold para sabihin natin magkaroon pa ng sabihin nating ng advantage yung Tulfo branding sa darating na midterm elections. Kasi kung titingnan ninyo, pwedeng tumakbo si Erwin na senator, another Tulfo sa national post. Tapos yun nga pwede ito maging parang springboard din sa darating na national na presidential election pala sa 2028. Kasi ang ano dito is kailangan yung name mo laging nasa kamalayan ng tao tuwing election. So yun yung parang nakita ko strategy na pwede nilang gawin. So in-expect ko natatakbo si Senator, si Erwin Tulfo as a senatorial candidate para makita rin nila ma-sustain yung name recall na actually very popular na. So parang magkaroon ng presence yung kanilang pangalan sa national parang level of political awareness.
Professor, nabanggit ni Richard kanina, opposition is in hibernation. Do you agree with that? I just asked kasi Ateneo is closely identified with.
Sorry,
that
UP ako
Baka may nalalaman kayo. We keep asking the traditional opposition
Identified lang, identified.
personalities, no? Kung anong ginagawa nila
Allegedly.
ngayon. Oo,
Allegedly.
anong ginagawa nila ngayon. Do you actually see them regrouping or reorganizing or preparing in earnest for 2025, which is really so close
Ay,
already?
bagitin lang natin Senator Drilon just the other day was
Yes.
here and he was saying, he said, one of the first things we have to do and that we are doing, sabi niya, the opposition is reorganizing their social media strategy and infrastructure. That's one of the things he said, yeah.
Kaya nga, tatanungin namin kayo, Professor, are you saying that, are they in hibernation or are they preparing in earnest?
Well, I can say that, based on my observation of various political groups that used to be part of yung coalition na binuo ni Vice President Leni Robredo, na very busy sila in, sabihin natin recruitment, constituency building. That's number one. Very busy sila these days. Number two, meron ding effort on the part of well-known opposition figures na mag-oppose ng tama. Okay? Number one na gusto ko i-highlight dyan si Senator Risa Ontiveros. Pag sinabing mag-oppose ng tama, hindi lang sila yung tira lang ng tira or criticize na ng criticize, minsan nag-a-dominate. No. Senator Risa, to me, parang has been effective in opposing some policies, sabihin natin even yung mga pinopropose na mga bills na nasa Senate na maayos yung kanyang sabihin natin contribution sa mga discussion. So na-appreciate ng mga tao yon kasi I'm sure natutunan na ng opposition yung lesson in the past, especially during the time of President Rodrigo Roa Duterte, na oppose sila ng oppose, nagiging ad hominem sila oftentimes, tapos hindi to nagre-resonate sa mga tao, kinaiinisan sila. So ngayon, nakita ko yung pagbabagong ito na kung saan yung pag-oppose ni Senator Risa at yung iba pang mga opposition figures, parang nasa level na ng policy, nasa level na ng discussion, hindi nagre-resort sa ad hominem. Tapos yung number 3 na pwede kong i-highlight, yes, they are preparing also for the midterm elections. Natural yan sa opposition forces, kahit sa ibang bansa, kailangan meron talagang ma-offer sila na alternative list of, candidates sa national level or even sa local. Pero aaminin ko, based din sa aking observation, na nahihirapan sila. Given that, the ruling coalition talaga is so popular. So, recently may mga nagtalunan pa nga na dating mga kaalyado or dating sumuporta kay VP Leni nung siya'y tumakbo ng presidente noong May 2022, lumipat, di ba, sa Partido Federal. So, nahihirapan sila in the sense that, wala silang resources, wala silang ma-offer talaga na sabihin nating political support sa mga tatakbo ng mga politiko. So, ito yung moment na kung saan they're really struggling to survive, to be resilient. But I tell you, kung mananatili sila na oposisyon at magiging consistent din sila sa mga ginagawa nila, alam mo maalala to ng mga tao at mabibiyayaan din sila perhaps in the future. Lahat ng opposition na naging resilient, nakukuha rin nila eventually yung power o yung poder sa mga susunod pang election. So yun yung parang parang pakiusap ko rin sa opposition forces these days na maging resilient lang sila. So natural na natatalo sa mga election, pero tama na yung ginagawa nila na dapat nagpe-prepare talaga sila at nagpapalawig pa ng political support.
Di ba nadadulute yung role ng opposition ngayon? Kasi individual, as Richard pointed out, pati nga si Senator Tulfo he takes up opposition issues he can take a position against the administration. Maraming gumagawa niyan. Si Senator Gatchalian, sila Senator Binay,
Amy Marcos.
Amy Marcos, yun. Very important, Amy Marcos. Yes.
Unfortunately, we all know that the opposition politicians na-disseminate sila kumbaga naubos sila in these past elections. At yun nga, kung makikita ninyo, dadalawa na lang sila sa Senate na opposition, tapos sa House naman nandun lang yung Makabayan Bloc, tapos sila Congressman Edsel Lagman, may mga ibang Liberal Party pa nga na pumupwesto sa majority, so naubos sila kung tutusin. At yun nga, sana yung nakikita nilang pag-oppose din ng mga kapwa nila senator at congressman, sana nasususugan nila ito or yun nga, parang nakakasundot-sundot sila kahit papano. Pero yun nga, tama kayo. Siguro, parang masyado na sila nabugbog at ayaw na siguro nila magkamali. At minsan, nagiging calculative na rin yung kanilang pag-atake. Kumbaga, ito yung mga panahon na nag-iingat din sila kung paano sila mag-oppose.
Pero yun nga, Prof, yung being more calculative, as you said, that's inevitable. They have to be more pragmatic as well. Not just for the elections, but even for the survival of the party even. Diba?
Yeah.
I mean, what's a path for, let's say, the Liberal Party?
Right.
Diba? What's a path for them to start, building coalitions with non-liberals? That at the same time they can still live with themselves, but at the same time they can start to have a wider, more meaningful base again.
My thing is, I mean, let me just qualify the hibernation mode because it might be misinterpreted as me being dismissive towards them. I completely agree with Arjun Aguirre, and he knows way better than me in terms of internal conversations, in terms of efforts here and there. What I'm saying is, medyo malayo pa dun sa kailangan for them to meet the threshold of functionality. Like we see, for instance, speaking of ad hominem, we saw a lot of ad hominem cartoons, sino mga behind this, against the president when the Maharlika Fund issue. I mean, a lot of criticism against Maharlika Fund is ad hominem attack against the Marcos family. Even if this may be based on factuality, politically, I don't think it's very helpful. Literally, we can talk about cartoons made about this. Second, the Lenny wishy-washiness, I understand that from a I need to take care of myself point of view. But for instance, I don't see rallying behind Rizzo Ontiveros. Go on Twitter, post something about Lenny. The level of reaction is immense, whether critical or supportive or somewhere in between. Post something about Rizzo Ontiveros, it's not even close, right? I can say that someone who's very active online, sometimes more active than I should be, right? So, so we saw the passing down of the batons a year ago, but there's no follow through. Exactly. So I just don't think Rizzo Ontiveros is getting the kind of love and support that she should get as the sole, really legitimate, full-fledged opposition, right? Because Rafi Tulfo never presents himself as an opposition. He presents himself as an independent senator, right? But Rizzo is, right? So when I say hibernation, I'm looking at that. Again, look at Liberal Party. Who are the leadership of Liberal Party? Some would say changes were made, but some would say it's kind of a reshuffling. Variation on a theme, some would even say, right? So when I look at a lot of these indicators, I see an effort, but is it anywhere close to the threshold whereby they can be a decisive force for 2025? I'm a bit skeptical. Maybe I don't know as much. Maybe Arjun knows more than me. But for me, on the outside, looking at popular sentiments, hindi siya malapit eh. But I completely agree what you mentioned a while ago. Lenny won more than 15 million votes. That is more than enough. I mean, President Duterte got 16 million votes to be a president. Aquino, much closer to that number. And I said, it doesn't look like the 60% thing will happen again because now Sara is down to 20. So actually, Lenny's competitive, or potentially Riza could be competitive. But there's not much, I just feel, alignment and preparation and all. Because we know in the US and other democracies, once the opposition is devastated in an election, they plan for the next 10 years. We saw that in Georgia, for instance. I just don't see that spirit there. And I don't see, for instance, the pink movement, which was super Bibo, had so much potential. I mean, when was the last time we see so many people on the streets paying from their own pockets, volunteerism level, and then we saw no falling off of that? Like what would it take for the opposition to do a kind of a anniversary of what happened last year without being politically threatening, just to retain solidarity, etc. Sir, absolutely right. I just don't see enough effort to translate that 15 million into a long-term movement that can put the opposition on a really competitive track for 2025 and 2028. I'm just not seeing yet.
And you will assume Angat Buhay is a genuine, sincere attempt to just be this, and it is not a political vehicle down the line.
I don't want to get into trouble. I said something about Angat Buhay. My understanding, Angat Buhay is a civil society organization. And we know that the unfortunate thing is that when certain civil society organizations have a more political tone, they can be targeted. We saw that a lot. So I think medyo ipit ang Angat Buhay. But the ideals, what Angat Buhay represents, if this can inspire many parallel movements all across the country, that could become a kind of a locomotive or mitochondria of a new movement. I mean, another person we didn't talk about at all, Vico Soto. He's very competitive to be the next senator, and yet what I see online is cancel culture because Vico Soto is not being progressive enough or anti-Marcos enough in 2023 compared to 2016. You know, that's unhealthy. So I think there's a lot of toxicity and denialism for me to feel confident about the opposition moving in the right direction. But can they do that? Absolutely they can.
Question of fact lang. Vico Soto is how old?
Vico Soto is 34, 33.
No, but he
Hindi pa pwede.
he still cannot run for.
No, he can run for Senate.
Ah, he can run for
yeah,
the
yeah,
Senate,
he can
yes.
run for Senate.
Ah, sige.
Yeah, President is still going to be like 38, 39, so it's still young. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. What about the professor?
Professor.
Fast forward.
Arjun, you wanna? you wanna?
About the opposition, yeah, I think you know it's very
must hope.
obvious that there's also a problem within, you know, the opposition forces nowadays. Sila nag-aawayan eh. Yun nga, kung makita ninyo, if the ruling coalition was made yun nga, out of convenience, itong sa naman sa opposition coalition, yung May 2022, makita nyo, based on principle. Ang kinakalungkot ko naman dito, yung principle na naging non-negotiable later on. So meron kanya-kanya silang mga vision, kanya-kanya silang mga pananaw, paningin sa mga issues na naging non-negotiable din na ito yung pinagmumulan ng internal conflict within the Pink Movement. So yung nabanggit kanina ni Prof. Richard, totoo yun, nangyayari yun na sila nag-aaway-away, hindi ka, yung kay Mayor Vico, for example, na-criticize siya for not, creating or, attending perhaps or saying something about EDSA. Celebration of EDSA ng Feb 25. So yun yung parang example na kung saan imbis na magkaroon ng sabihin nating meaningful cooperation, dialogue between among forces, wala eh. Kanya-kanya silang trabaho, kanya-kanyang framing. Kaya may kita ninyo madali itong nabuwag later on. So maliban sa dun sa factor na nabanggit kanina na wala nga naging continuity on the part of yung mga political players dun sa Pink Movement. Wala silang follow-through na ginawa. So tama naman yung nabanggit ni Prof. Richard kanina na yung based din sa observation ko na after the May 2022 elections, naging tahimik eh. Naging tahimik yung Pink Movement. Merong mga attempts to revive, to activate the network, but hindi sila nasusustain. Kadalasan, nagpo-focus lang sila dun sa minute, mga specific, particular issues of the day, na kung saan parang eventually madaling nadidissolve din agad yung pagkilos ng mga iba't ibang political forces.
Okay. It is 2023. We are talking about 2028.
Advance mag-isip, advance
Iniisip
mag-isip.
ko nga, I wonder what a foreigner watching the show might be thinking. Na, why are they
Don't be
talking about...
impressed! Di ba? Visionary tayo. Forward-looking.
Okay, anyway, we will carry on with this conversation for 5 more years. Richard Hidarian and Professor Arjan Aguirre, maraming salamat sa inyo.
Thank you.
Thanks, sirs.
Thank you.
Salamat.
And that's it for the Chiefs. Ako po si Robbie Alampay.
We hope what was discussed here will keep the conversation going. I'm Ami Pamintuan.
I'm Ed Lingao. We are One News, all sides, all the time.